Greetings, my name is Vincent, and in this episode I finally get round to wiping the dust off my Legions Imperialis box set and painting a miniature from it. We're going to be painting the Solar Auxilia Sentinel, and we're going to be painting it as the Theta-Garmon Deathless cohort, here at Bunker 6. Apologies to all of my regular Bunker 6 viewers that it is taking me so unbelievably long to open this box set up. It was kind of a pressure to actually take this on because obviously my channel is dedicated to things like this, but I really didn't know where to start and I didn't want to rush these things. I also had the gaming board to finish, but enough excuses. Let's get into this Legions Imperialis box set. As you can see, there's a fair amount of plastic there. Not as much as, say, the epic 40k box sets back in the day, but things have changed in the last 25 years. And look, hey look, Games Workshop gave me a spare mini. There we go. All forgiven. Now we're going to look inside this box set here. We have this divider, which has got some logos on the front, and then of course some obligatory, here's some other stuff that you can buy from Games Workshop on the back. And all very good artwork, and all very good models, in my opinion. Now this is quite a nice, dense, chonky rulebook. I have two of these, one for my wife and one for myself, so we can learn the rules simultaneously, and I'm really looking forward to getting things started. Here are the cardboard counters that I will not be using. I've ordered some plastic replacements, and here is a reference sheet, and this is actually the instruction manual for assembly. And here are some little transfers, how adorable. We won't be using these today. And underneath the inlay cardboard is a set of dice to play the game and multiple bases, two for the Warhounds as you can see here, with some nice details on them, and a bunch of bases for the infantry and the like. This is all the stuff that you get in the box set. Lovely photography and great paint jobs. These are the instructions for the Sentinel, all very elementary and will take us no time at all to assemble. But one of the most important things is getting rid of all the mold lines. Now, mold lines don't really change in terms of scale, so what smaller you get with your model, the more those mold lines are going to stand out. So I highly recommend getting your nail polish buffer out and the back of a scalpel blade, and getting rid of as many of those as you possibly can. Now actually, when I was taking the model off the sprue, I did actually snap a couple of pieces because I wasn't expecting them to be as weak as they are. So do be very careful when you are removing these parts from the sprue. You know, I stupidly decided to glue the model onto the base. I would recommend that you put it on some double-sided tape and then stick it to like a wooden stick or something, just so you can have easier access to the base, and also much better options if you want to batch paint the bases separately. But I make it work here nonetheless. So I'm just going to do a prime on the model first, and then I'm going to start adding some layers in. We're doing the zenithal technique right after adding this mid-tone blue-grey. Once the blue-grey is on, then I'm going to only be hitting the top of the model with the lighter greys and white. Every single thing that I paint here is generally about 50% the paint and 50% paint thinners. This is a much smoother approach than using a paintbrush, and honestly you could do all of this in a batch paint style, but I really wanted to just focus in on this model for the video rather than getting all batch painty and cutting corners. One of the difficult things about doing a video like this is I don't have much source material. This is the Theta-Garmon Deathless cohort, which there's basically zero information apart from one photograph online that I found. I did search high and low, I can only find a logo and a black and white Solar Auxilia infantryman. So we're just going to add some go faster stripes here and there, some black shoulder pads and things like that, just to sort of give the impression that I have some vague idea of what the Theta-Garmon Deathless cohort should actually look like. Now I had a lot of trouble painting this model due to the fact that I didn't have any reference material to go on. I was really second guessing myself every other thing I was painting onto this model. So much so that I actually had to repaint the model once because I was very dissatisfied with the main copper color that I had on the model. I went with Brassy Brass by Vallejo Game Color first. I really didn't like it was far too orange, so I went with Brass Scorpion instead by Games Workshop. It just was a little less aggressive in the orange tones that were cutting through, and I feel this works really well. And as you can see, I'm just working my way around the model, making sure to not hit the bits that I still want to keep white. And also I still know in the back of my mind that I have an oil wash that's going to be smothered all over this model, just to really help glue all those different high contrast colors together. Now the paintbrush size I'm using is 00. Obviously this model is tiny despite how big it looks on the screen. You can use a brush that's bigger, but just make sure obviously it has a very fine point. I'm using barely any paint on my brush any time that I'm painting, which can be a little bit of a pain because the paint can dry out very quickly under my studio lighting. But I'm just making sure that I take my time, especially considering I had such issues with the copper framework earlier on. And the key thing that I'm keeping in the back of my mind is contrast, contrast, contrast. At this scale, you want things to pop. I'm already lucky because I'm using this white color. I think that's going to do a really great job of making things pop on the battlefield. But every single color that I add on top of this model, whether it be the reds or the blues or the yellows, I want to be super vibrant. Even though it might look a little bit cartoony, I'm hoping that the oil wash will dull down some of that vibrancy, but at least making sure that at a distance, when you're looking down at the table, each model has character and pops. If some of these details seem a little bit unnecessary and overwhelming, you can always skip one of the steps here and there. It wouldn't make too much of a difference. I just want to give people the most dense version of how I'd paint one of these things, and then you can pick and choose the bits that you keep or take out in your own painting process if you choose to go this route. The other thing as well, obviously this is a very uncommon paint scheme. I mean, there's not particularly much information out there about the Solar Auxilia. At the best of times, especially with these kind of new introduced cohorts that seem to appear sporadically in some of the books. But at the same time, I think it's important that I supply fresh takes on things. That's why I went with this more obscure cohort over one of the more common ones. There's plenty of videos out there that cover other cohorts, more popular paint schemes anyway, so I thought it'd be kind of interesting doing a whole army in a cohort that's not particularly popular. Now, I decided to do as many different metallic colors as possible because I want anyone who sees the model to see that a lot of attention has been paid to the model despite how small the scale of it is. I think the more detail that you can push into a model like this by using varied colors really helps sell that idea. You don't need to necessarily do lots of glazing and crazy lighting effects and things like that, but just making as many colors hit the model as possible in a complementary way does a lot of the heavy lifting for you, I think. And once I had finished with all of the metallics, I moved on to just highlighting this little knee pad. Now, I do a really messy job in the video, but I do tidy it up off camera. The way I tidy it up is just by putting some additional black over those grey lines, and that tidies everything up quite nicely. As I keep on saying, there's going to be an oil wash completely smothered over this model at a later point, and that's going to hold everything together, hide a lot of messy parts, things that just don't sit well, and as soon as this base is finished, you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. Now, I'm using Mechanicus Standard Grey out of the pot, but I would have probably preferred to have done it with an airbrush because it would have been much quicker and smoother, but I just took my time and did multiple thin layers. And once they were all dry, I moved on to doing a highlight with Administratum Grey, but making sure to really not hit that base too hard just in case I pulled up the previous layers of Mechanicus Standard Grey. I'm just working around the edges. Now, this is quite a light grey, so I wasn't too concerned if I'd hit the actual model. It's quite a chunky dry brush, but it did the job quite well. When you go with smaller dry brushes at this scale, sometimes you can run the risk of pushing too much paint in one specific area and it looks like a brush stroke. That's why I stuck with a chunkier dry brush over a thinner one. And there we are. The results look pretty natural, and then we're going to move on to the next step. The final highlight is going to be with Ulthuan Grey. I am using a narrow dry brush at this point, but we're using it so sporadically I wasn't too concerned. We're literally just doing 3 or 4 dabs. Once we've done the edge highlight, just pushing it down in a few places where we think things would be more bright than others. Now, I'm not too concerned about the brightness here because I am going to be covering this with an oil wash, and that's going to be blending everything together, making everything look a bit more natural. And to also make things look a little bit more visually appealing, I'm going to be selecting one of the slabs from each of the concrete floor panels and just making sure that it has a different color to it, like this. I'm going to keep them consistently the same across all of them, just so there's at least that uniformity, but I want there to be some irregularity in where the particular panel is painted. So one of the larger panels could be painted white, or one of the smaller ones could. We also have the Auxilia that's on the floor here that we're going to be painting in a very, very burnished copper/brass color, and then we're going to be covering the whole thing in oil paint. Now normally I would go in with a varnish before I lay down some oil paints like this, but I actually wanted the oil paint to kind of soak into the acrylics. A lot of the time when you add varnish, it obviously goes into all of the nooks and crannies and doesn't sit on the surfaces of the model that you're oil washing. But in this case, I really wanted to just have a bit more of a natural finish, a bit more of a rugged finish than something particularly clinical by having the oil wash sitting on a gloss varnish. But we will be adding gloss varnish to the model because we do want it to be sitting in the recesses rather than being smothered all over the place, unlike the flooring of the model. Now you can use any gloss varnish you want. I used this and it did the job quite nicely. And then we're just going to go over the entire model, just making sure that none of the oil wash drips too much on the floor that we've already worked on. And once we're finished with that, we're going to let it dry overnight, because I wanted the oil to be quite sticky. I didn't want it to be able to come off the model quite easily, because this is a dirty model. I don't want it to be too crisp and too clean, so the longer you leave it, the harder it is to get the oil wash off of the model, and that's what we're going to be doing. But once we've added some paint thinners, it shouldn't be too much of an issue. As long as the paint is completely dry though, we have more control when we do start taking things off. If the oil is not completely dry, then you can start smearing paint all over the place and giving yourself more problems than you want. I'm not really doing too much here because I'm pretty satisfied with how the oil has settled on the model. Most important areas I'm working on are raised areas and the top of the model, where I don't think oil would be sitting the most. Now it looks like oil when it's like this, but as soon as you add some ultra matte varnish, it suddenly transforms into what looks much more like dirt. And that is the magic moment for me with this oil process. Throw the ultra matte varnish on, throw it under a hairdryer, and it looks much more realistic. And as so often can happen, when you start adding dark washes to bright models, you start losing some of the brightness in areas that you'd rather keep it. So I'm just putting in some brighter metallics again that got dulled down a little bit too much by the oil wash, and then we're going to be proceeding on to adding highlights to other areas outside of the gold framework that need a little bit of attention here and there. I decided not to add any highlights in the white department because I was really happy with how the oil wash settled in. As you can see here, that oil wash looks completely part of the model now, and I didn't want to add a brilliant white over the top and start making things feel unrealistic. But the metallics didn't seem like less of a concern by adding ultra bright points like you can see here. And as I did with the gold, I will now attempt to do with the silver, just finding very, very raised points that I think would do with a little bit more pop. Now I didn't use the original silver color for this. I actually went in with a highlight silver to make the reflective elements of the silver parts much more emphatic. Now we are on the home straight. I just want to leave you with one final point, which is if there's one thing to take away from painting at this scale, it is brush control. I'm not talking about accuracy, but I'm talking about paint pressure. How much pressure you're putting on that brush. If you start pushing down your brush too heavily, you're going to be losing details real quick and making a big mess. So just make sure that you really focus on how light you're hitting the model with that paintbrush. And with all that being said, the model is now finished. There we are, the Theta-Garmon Deathless Sentinel. I hope you enjoyed the episode and learned something. I'm also very intrigued as to what kind of cohorts you are going to be painting your solo Auxilia as. Please let us know down below in the comments. But as always, until next time, I'm Vincent signing off from here at Bunker 6.